Welcome back, adventurers and friends, to Adventure Inward's Let's Talk series. To those who are here for the first time, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Just a reminder to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe. It's free. Don't forget to hit the notification bell if you would like to know when I post new videos. Today, we will be talking about how to love yourself and how to do it unconditionally. So get comfy cozy, open your heart, open your mind, and let's get into it. How to love yourself advice is everywhere these days. Step into your favorite local gift shop and you will likely find self-love manifesting candles topped with rose quartz, positive affirmation card decks, and pillows embossed with Brené Brown self-compassion quotes. Scroll through Instagram or TikTok, and you will probably encounter influencer types spouting self-love advice that often ignores the many complex reasons why someone might struggle with self-worth. A barrage of, quote-unquote, you just have to love yourself, toxic positivity. Self-love sells, and we really aren't buying it though. While it may seem cheesy or oversimplified, most mental health professionals will tell you, in one way or another, that being kinder to and more accepting of yourself is important for both mental well-being and healthy relationships. However, a variety of factors, trauma, years of criticism, and systematic discrimination can make this simple sounding practice way more complicated and much easier said than done. Chances are, if you have clicked on this, you could use some support in the self-compassion area. That's why I researched and spoke to a few therapists who specialize in the topic. Let's talk about their practical tips on how to truly love yourself. First of all, think of self-love as a practice, not a destination, and define it for yourself. There is no finish line you cross when you officially love yourself. Self-love is neither constant nor permanent. It's also not the same thing as being in love with yourself. So if the word love doesn't feel right to you, consider working toward acceptance or neutrality. We often define love in this fairy tale sense, where everything needs to be perfect, and then apply that same pressure to self-love, which isn't realistic. We don't have to love everything about ourselves, and certain days will be easier than others. Just like with other long-term relationships. Sometimes loving ourselves is just commitment, perseverance, acceptance, or general neutrality. And don't expect to cultivate new thought patterns overnight. Like any habit, accepting and being kinder to yourself does take practice. Second, know that you don't have to love your reality in order to love, accept, or forgive yourself. Imagine your closest friends and family members who show up with love for you when you're at your worst, least successful. Insert negative adjective self. Now, ask yourself if you treat yourself the same way. We love our friends and family despite their faults, but it's so hard for many of us to love our faulty selves. When we realize that perfection is not the prerequisite to being loved by other people or loving yourself, you could begin to practice self-acceptance and maybe, eventually, self-love. But anyone who's been weighed down by woulds, shoulds, and coulds knows that accepting your mistakes and imperfections can feel near impossible. When I work with clients, I see the majority of their suffering coming from a longing for things to be different from how they are. Some professionals use a dialectical behavior therapy practice called radical acceptance to help people accept the reality of their lives while also having hope for the future. This practice is rooted in the theory that to accept our imperfect selves, we must first acknowledge our reality. What we resist persists. In other words, if you deny what's happening, you are more likely to get stuck in negative self-talk, such as, it shouldn't be this way, or I shouldn't have done that. Conversely, if you practice acknowledging your reality in non-judgmental terms, such as, this is my situation, or this is what happened, you'll be better able to accept and move past the things you can't control. The word accept is key here. You don't have to like what's happening. For example, it's okay and natural to feel disappointed that you didn't get called back for a second interview. But accepting the facts of the situation, they didn't call me back and I'm disappointed, can prevent you from feeling like you are a disappointment. The idea is to avoid getting stuck in a self-blame spiral by first validating your thoughts and feelings, and then practicing self-acceptance instead of repeatedly berating yourself for what you should have done differently. Yes, even if you mispronounce the company's name. Self-forgiveness is another practice that can foster self-love and acceptance. Again, forgiving yourself is often much easier in theory than it is in practice. But one way that's recommended letting yourself off the hook is to identify the wisdom you gained from a discouraging situation. If, for example, a relationship doesn't work out, try not to be hard on yourself for the 5 months you invested in the other person or a way you acted that you're not proud of. Instead, ask yourself what you learned during those months that might benefit you in the future. Self-love doesn't mean we won't make mistakes. It supports us in taking responsibility when we do something we are not happy about, so we can more easily move forward. The process of learning to accept and or forgive yourself may bring up deep sadness. When you think about how much time you've spent beating yourself up, comparing yourself to others, or being convinced that you were bad or broken, there could be quite a bit of grief. It's normal and even healthy to grant yourself time to feel that loss, so long as you eventually work on accepting whatever happened in the past so you can move forward and embrace your future as an opportunity to live differently. Third, challenge your negative mental narrative by sticking to the facts. Buddhists explain suffering as 2 arrows. The first arrow is the unfortunate event that happened to us, a painful arrow outside of our control. The second arrow is the story we tell ourselves about that event. This suffering is self-inflicted. Self-love means not shooting ourselves with that second arrow. The first arrow, for example, could be the fact that a loved one dies of COVID-19. The second arrow could be you telling yourself that they wouldn't have died if you'd convinced them to go to the doctor sooner. Or it might be you telling yourself that you should have spent the holidays with them, despite the fact that they weren't vaccinated. In other words, a situation can be emotionally painful, of course, but the story we tell ourselves about it is often the main source of our suffering. The good news is we can work on not adding to our pain with this negative narrative. If, however, regrets or other negative thoughts start seeping in about a painful event, look at the facts. Is there any evidence against these thoughts? Is there anything you can identify that makes things seem less bleak? You're not denying reality, but instead pointing out all the things that exist at once. So, you got laid off from your job. Does that mean you're bad at what you do? Is there evidence that proves it had nothing to do with your performance? Or perhaps your performance at work has suffered due to challenges outside of your control. Or maybe you really weren't great at your job because it was a bad match for your skills and strengths. But that doesn't mean you are a bad person. By identifying all the facts, you are better able to recognize what you are and are not in control of, and to avoid letting a challenging event define your self-worth. Another way to challenge our inner negative narrative is to ask ourselves where those thoughts are coming from. For example, maybe social media posts that trigger comparison can fuel negative self-talk. Consider those filtered Instagram pics from someone you haven't seen since high school that make you feel your life pales in comparison to theirs, or that you are somehow less worthy. Ask yourself, where is that story coming from? And is it actually true? Those questions may help you realize that negative thoughts about yourself often aren't facts, but results of cultural or childhood conditioning. Sometimes we internalize the voice of a hypercritical parent. For example, the mother with low self-esteem who berated herself when she made mistakes. Or the father who was quick to point out his perceived physical flaws. Breaking intergenerational patterns is hard. And it's hard to do, but it can also be an empowering step in cultivating self-love. It's exciting to realize that negative patterns, like being severely critical of your body or abilities, can stop with you. Self-love isn't about blaming our parents or caregivers. It's possible that they did the best that they could at the time they were raising you, and you didn't get what you needed when you were little. You are not responsible for the ways in which we were hurt, misunderstood, or neglected by caregivers when we were children. But it is our responsibility as adults to address and adjust the coping strategies we develop to deal with that pain. Again, learning to accept what happened in the past so you can move through it, maybe with a therapist, if you're struggling on your own, can help you grow closer to self-love. Fourth, acknowledge that oppression and trauma can make self-love even more challenging. If you belong to a marginalized or historically oppressed group, you may internalize social messages telling you you're not valuable. And even if you don't believe those messages about your particular group are true about you, there can be pressure to overcome and overperform in an attempt to disprove them. Some people start to neglect their physical, emotional, and mental needs in the process of trying to prove on an outward level that they're worthy and that they deserve respect. It can also be harder for survivors of trauma, who often struggle with shame and self-blame, to believe they are worthy of love. With interpersonal trauma, like sexual assault, or something else that violates boundaries, the implicit message is that you're not worthy of respect. It's very common for survivors of trauma to internalize that message and think, There must be something wrong with me that this person did this to me. Working through oppression and a trauma can be incredibly challenging on your own, and that is why it is recommended unpacking these issues with a therapist, if you're able. But trying to be kinder to our bodies can be one small step toward healing. When we honor our bodies, we can shift our relationship with them away from judgment and acknowledge that they, and we, are worthy of love and care. What does honoring your body look like? It is recommended soothing self-care classics like taking a warm bath with essential oils or scented candles, or queuing up some of your favorite songs and dancing it out in your living room. But your body-centered kindness doesn't have to look like that. Going for a walk, feeding yourself a delicious meal, or wearing comfortable pants, for example, might be more appealing to you. Fifth, practice setting boundaries in real life and online to build self-worth. Setting safe boundaries in relationships is an important step in cultivating self-love. Avoid giving your time and energy to people, that includes parents, friends, or partners, who trigger feelings of unworthiness. Part of practicing self-worth is not seeking water from an empty well. It is recommended making relational and sexual choices that center around pleasure, comfort, safety, and communication. You might have to end a relationship with someone who makes you feel bad about yourself. A red flag in romantic relationships, for example. And if you can't necessarily stop all communication right away or at all, in the case of demanding bosses, say, or a critical parent, try practicing radical acceptance and setting even small boundaries, like ending a phone conversation with a loved one who's bringing you down, or not checking your work email after a certain time in the evening. 6. Remind yourself that loving, or at least accepting, yourself is a worthwhile pursuit. As I mentioned earlier, social media influencers may make self-love seem superficial or even toxic, as in using it as a way to avoid taking responsibility for one's actions or attributing success to self-love instead of privilege. But loving yourself has the potential to profoundly impact your life if you define it as an acceptance of who you are and a commitment to personal growth. Self-love isn't navel-gazing and never contributing to the world. It's actually the best foundation to have a loving, healthy partnership with someone else. It's the best foundation to be a parent. It's the best foundation to share your gifts as you work in the world. Remember, it's vital for you to learn to be kind to yourself. Give yourself grace and always, always love yourself. Thank you for joining me.